Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you are listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast. Welcome back. It's been a lot longer than we initially anticipated. Whole host of circumstances. If you live in the Oklahoma, southern region or whatever, you'll know that we have like lots of different weather events, sicknesses, just stuff kind of conspiring against us to record. I don't know if the stuff is Satan or the whatever weatherman you hate the most,
or maybe they needed a rest. Us.
That's very possible. But we're excited to be back. And so we have some long-term plans. Eventually, whether it's next week or the week after, we'll be jumping into the story of Elijah. And we have a new kind of spin on that. And we'll talk to you a little bit more about that when we get there. But it's something that Jason has put a lot of work into and I put some marginal work into. And so we're excited to see kind of a slightly new thing that we're going to try to do. But just we thought for our first episode back of the new year that we would just kind of do an old classic. We'd go back to the old Jesus guy and talk about a story that we've talked around, but we have not specifically processed through this passage.
Yeah, so the context is Luke chapter 7, and I'm going to begin reading in 31, but what has happened is that comes before this is John the Baptist had sent a messenger to Jesus to ask if he was really the Messiah. Effectively, Jesus answered him. Then he turns to the crowd, so John is still in prison alive. And he turns to the crowd and he asks them, he uses the opportunity to talk about their faith and what drew them to John. He knows his audience very well. And it's a mixed audience of leaders and people who believed in John, were baptized by John, and then Pharisees there. And so Jesus, I think, gives a really fascinating, I'm excited about processing this because it gives just a fascinating step back and consider what's the motivation of the audience. So beginning in verse 31, he says this. To what then can I compare the people of this generation? What are they like? They are like children sitting in the marketplace and calling out to each other. We played the pipe for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, you did not cry. For John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and you say, he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say, here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proved right by all her children. So, my friend Connor, as you process this, what jumps out at you? What amazes you?
I think what amazes me is how relatable I find Jesus here. And not to say that what I'm going to say going forward might sound like, oh man, like all of my beliefs about the world and all my opinions on relationships and how things should be and how things should get solved are right and completely in line with Jesus. That's where I'd like to be, but I recognize that's not the case. But it's so funny to me how Jesus calls out, I don't want to say both sides, but he speaks directly to he speaks directly to this urge in all of us to always look for a reason to not agree or to not move, to not believe. And I think this is just one of those really powerful things that I have to remind myself, whether it's day-to-day life or my relationship with God or when I'm interacting with other people. Like we, myself included to the extreme, we are all looking for a reason to not be moved away from where we are currently. Even a lot of times if we're in a pretty painful place, if it's not completely excruciating, we can usually find a way to not be moved, to not change, to stay exactly where we are. And it can be so frustrating because oftentimes when we find like here's the thing, Jesus makes this really beautiful analogy, like a brilliant analogy. And it can seem so silly, right? You go like, of course, like when you lay it out like that, that's so ridiculous. But if you've spent all your time and you grew up around people that were like, you grew up around people that were self-righteous, self-righteous monks who starved themselves, who fasted, and that's how they showed their purity and their righteousness to everyone around you. And John the Baptist came doing something that looks similar. You would have a natural inclination to not want to believe that he was doing a good new thing. And so for me, it's just like maybe that's my maybe I moved on to my perplexion accidentally. So I'll wrap us back around to my amazement. It's just amazing to me how clearly Jesus lays this out and how accurately it describes just this aspect of the human condition.
Yeah, I love that. I'll jump in with that. That's what amazed me. I'll frame it this way: how committed humanity is and was to being unhappy. Like it's. I remember somebody was saying we were processing. Peter in the boat watching Jesus walk in the water. And why don't we step out? And that's just a tremendous metaphor. It always applies. What is it about me that keeps me from engaging? And I think that's great self-awareness and good to process that in your own self. And she framed it by, well, I know my craziness. I know my unsettledness. I know my stupidity. But to step out in brand new unknown, it's what's that old phrase, the devil you know versus the devil you don't, you know? And I love that Jesus can step out of the heat of this. I'm not even contemplating right now, so let me take a moment to think, what does it feel like? It's not just like a cousin, because depending on your relationship with cousins, that may not have any, connection or affection for you, the listener, or us. But the first person to acknowledge him, I mean, this is the person that leapt in the womb. So this is pre-knowledge from Jesus' perspective, as far as I know, if he's a normal, person in the womb. But John is the first one to say, look, this is the Messiah. There's something special. And he took all of his reputation. I don't know if you ever had this experience where somebody has reputation and you wish you did as being credible and trustworthy and wise, and they give you some of that. I mean, John the Baptist is the first one to do that. And now you have the relational dynamic where John the Baptist is in prison. Maybe Jesus even knows he's going to die, and John is, I think, and we made this case like our first episode or second episode, John makes this appeal, I think, to say, hey, are you going to come save me? And Jesus just said functionally no. And then he extols John. So he's got all this emotion going on. And I wonder, now this is that humanity piece of Jesus, is a little of Jesus' humanity saying, I guess the question to me is, why share this now? Why do this step away? It's kind of a meta-narrative. He's like, do you see all this stuff that's happening? Can I tell you about you? Because he's not talking hypothetically. He's saying, these people in front of me, meaning you, the audience, you're unpleasable. You're unpleasable. And here's the other thing is, you set rules that you think, oh man, that just mind-blowing to me. You set rules that you think are absolutes, and I'm telling you they're functionally irrelevant. That's staggering. Because when you said about John the Baptist looked a little like the Pharisees, I'm like, yeah, I never thought about that. He was coming in that vein in terms of the ascetic nature, the fasting, this kind of stuff. Jesus comes along and he literally gets asked, why are your disciples not fasting? Like John's are. So there is this comparison. Now the opposite of John is, of course, or the opposite of the Pharisees is John's way out. He's not seeking power in that same way. But the bottom line is...
But if you were to but at any point, and if you caught John on the wrong day, or all you had heard was what your buddy had said who had, gone out to the wilderness or whatever, like your perspective on what John is doing could be skewed. And if that was all you knew, and that was like, okay, I'm going to build my thoughts on John, or build my thoughts on what God is doing here and now in the kingdom of Israel under, the rule of Rome. If I was to I think this is a massive part of what Jesus could be talking about is... we tend to, one, to not be happy like you're talking about, but two, we also tend to build so much of our thoughts and identity on an incomplete premise, or not even, or something that God never even intended to be a premise for thought or beliefs or way we do something.
That is exactly what I needed. That dynamic there, it's amazing that Jesus would take the time in whatever emotion he was experiencing to say, do you see yourself? Do you see yourself? And how neither of these perspectives are really useful to you, Now, what perplexes me is will come up, and it kind of I don't know what to make of that piece yet. Hence the perplexion, but it is that dynamic of this is such a cutting thing, and then when I look at myself, I'm like, okay, what premises am I basing my life on? The way I treat people, the way I teach, the way I live my life, that are not well thought out. You know, and I'm not even suggesting the evil ones. I'm talking about the good ones.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah, and I wonder if that's you kind of commented that like it does seem like Jesus zooms out here to kind of make a meta observation on what's going on here, and I wonder if that's why we kind of get that feeling from this passage, because one, this is you can use this metaphor and map it pretty closely onto what his audience might have been feeling about a specific issue, but two, the easy thing was if it was just completely like if it was direct teaching, right? If it was completely direct teaching on, hey, you're messing up on this, and this is how you're viewing it completely wrong, then we could maybe escape the idea of like, well, maybe we could escape the idea that that Jesus wants to tell us that we are constantly living our lives based on false premises and constantly making decisions based on things that Jesus doesn't find interesting and doesn't find compelling.
Right. I love the way it doesn't find interesting. And if he doesn't find it interesting, that means it's not valuable.
Yeah, and I think,
for life. Yeah, I love that.
And I think so many times, I think there have been answers to my prayers before where I had like a big concern about something, and I went to God with it over and over and over again, and not in a mean way and not in a harsh way, but I remember there's a specific example I'm thinking of where the answer from God for me was like, Connor, one, I care, like it was like I could feel the care that God had for how I was feeling in the situation, but the intensity of which I was stressing over a specific act that had happened was like, man, Connor, like you, like this for me, what felt like I was like, I am not interested in that for you. Like I am not, that is not what you should be focusing on. And I think it is important to remind ourselves. I do think oftentimes the things we, especially like in churchy settings, when we get really amped up about things, maybe not directly to us, but I think oftentimes if Jesus was to address a congregation, he would just be like, the things that you worry about, I do not find interesting or compelling at all.
Wow.
And I mean, and the reality becomes one, it's easy to say that about the church. How many things, if Jesus walked in on Sunday, would he be like, yeah, this is how does this pertain to what I came to do? Or, how does this connect? But the scarier question goes about how I live my life personally. And not to say that like, and when I say interest, I'm not saying like Jesus would be like, walk in and be like, see your, what is NBA basketball? How is NBA basketball interesting to you? But maybe the obsession and the whatever. I'm going down too much of a rabbit hole.
No, but to take that, when you were talking through that, I'm like, I just imagine myself in my mind's eye sitting there with Jesus, and this is the magic of Jesus to me. The amazing piece of Jesus is I think he would say, Jason, none of that's interesting to me, and that's a way I've never framed anything that Jesus would say to me, but it draws me in. Mm-hmm. Like when you say, if I'm going on and on about the NBA, and you're like, Jason, that doesn't interest me, I'm like, oh, I that's a loss in our relationship. I'm like, oh, okay. Not just the lack of interest in the NBA, but you're shutting me down. I think, well, it depends on what you're wanting.
Yeah.
If I'm saying, Jesus, I did all these things, I want your approval, and he said that doesn't interest me, and we could use 15 other ways of saying that Jesus does say, Mm-hmm. Get behind me, Satan would be a harsh way that Jesus says, this does not interest me, for example.
But I think what's interesting in our culture for how important it is that you validate, and I'm not saying like culture, I'm saying myself, how important it is you validate my interests, my, like the things I like to do and the things that I really draw identity from. Man, I think for many people, the idea of Jesus saying what you are talking about or what you're focusing on is not interesting to me could be more damning for them personally than hearing Jesus say, get behind me, Satan, would have been for Peter.
Yeah, I think you're right, man. That's really, really good. So my takeaway in this piece of it is that picture of him sitting with me and saying, Jason, that doesn't interest me. Does that draw me in? Am I thinking, oh, what does interest you? Or am I like, oh, yeah, I'm offended? Because I think how this plays out in real life is I pray for something, I want something, it doesn't happen, then I feel a little bit betrayed by God. Mm-hmm. What he's really saying is that doesn't interest me. Because it's not for your good, it won't lead to kingdom stuff, whatever it is.
Yeah, and the thing that I think Jesus could specifically speak to in this situation, and a lot of our situations, is we go, Jesus, there's option A and there's option B, and Jesus goes, those are two just stupid options,
right?
And I'm not interested in following any of those.
Yes.
And so here, here's the third way, but for us, oftentimes we get this narrow-minded vision of it can only be this way or that way, or maybe even a third way, and Jesus just goes, none of those options are compelling. None of those options are things that bring about life,
yes,
or that are a major pillar of the kingdom of God. And I think sometimes Jesus wants to be harsh in that way to shake us loose, because if all we can see is the one or two options, and Jesus says, hey, that's not what this is about, we're going to pull away because we're like, well, then if he doesn't say this right way, he must think it's going to be the option that I don't want. When in reality, Jesus, I think, is trying to constantly jar us loose of the idea that his way is going to fit into the way that we automatically, and that his way is going to fit into a preconceived notion of how we are supposed to act, how a group of people are supposed to act in any given situation.
Yeah, that's good. Now, I'm going to jump in quick to perplexing, because this is the part, well, that perplexes me. There we go. There, all original content here, folks. Verse 35, he's just said, you guys are children. He's just basically made the case, you're looking at this all wrong, exactly how you just articulated. And then he says, but wisdom, which is knowing how to do right from the knowledge, with the knowledge you have, wisdom is proved right by all her children. I'm just going to own, I don't know what he's talking about there. I can give you some thoughts, but at the end of the day, I'm like, I wouldn't, after the previous verses, I wouldn't say the natural conclusion to this section, and it is a section break, because the next thing is when one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him in verse 36, and the way that's framed, that could be days later, years later, well, not years, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I don't know if it happened right after, so this is the end of this discourse, but wisdom is proved right by all her children. It seems to me the previous verses don't lead to this. You've just said they're unwise, and now they're wise. So that's one take I have on it. So I bring it to you, and I'm like, you got something for me there?
So I cheated, and I'm not saying this is authoritative, but I went and looked at what Eugene Peterson has to say in the Message translate, or the Message, whatever, however you would like to phrase that. And so he said, the way he interprets it, he says, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And so what I'm wondering here, just kind of grabbing on that idea, grabbing on that awesome sentence, and then grabbing onto kind of some other kind of context around this passage, I'm wondering if here Jesus is, I wonder if what Jesus could be talking about is that, drawing on what we talked about before, when we talk about a third way or a fourth way, or the way that, the way that doesn't seem to be there, when we're so focused on the one or the two or the A or the B, and Jesus comes to offer a third way. I wonder if what he could be saying is like, listen, wisdom, purity, all the things that we seek after, all the goodness of the kingdom of God is proven in the lives of people who refuse to live out the false dichotomy that you are living your life out on. Maybe that's the case. I don't know. But when we encounter people that are not bothered, that one can engage in hard discussions like that Jesus engages it with here, but also chooses to live out and believe in a third way, and is ultimately confident and unbothered by the demands of the people around them to choose A or B, I am so compelled by that person. In fact, this is one of those things that draws me so much to Jesus, because when I encounter this, like in the wild, in real life, when I see somebody live out this way in Jesus, I am so utterly and completely drawn to them, because it just speaks to me on a whole other level.
So let me make sure I'm tracking here. So what you're saying is, when you see someone that is truly open to God's lead, so you experience them as free, as centered, as calm, as ready, then you watch them in action when crisis hits, and they're flexible and resilient and these kind of things, that's what draws you in? Because that's another way to me of saying always open to the third option.
Sure. And I think for me, yeah, and so, but wisdom is proved right by all her children. And I think, I think for me, it's when you see the fruit of true wisdom, which is what Jesus is trying to get out of here. That is what is compelling to me. Somebody that is not, all those things you said. So again, I don't know if specifically that's exactly what Jesus is talking about here, but it could be.
Well, I like it. For what it's worth, I'm looking at interlinear with Greek and the Yoda version, and was justified wisdom by all the children. And so it is interesting. And that word for children is literally children, a child. Okay. So nothing by the descendants. So I wonder if the operative word is the all, which emphasizes the third way. And we understand by third way, we mean millionth way or billionth way. There's always another way, It's corollary to when I say, here, how are we going to, I always go to this because people don't feel yet threatened by this, but when the first clone comes into your church and into your gathering, and they say, I want to be saved, will you offer them salvation, And I can freely say, I don't know how to handle that yet. And that yet speaks the volumes of, but God does. God's going to be ready for the clone conversions or however that goes, And if there's never clones, that's fine because it gives me a non-threatening example to reference,
Or the AI conversions. That's what I always like to bring up.
Now, see, that I don't say that because we're going to start arguing about that in about a half hour in history, But that idea that all is that operative term, that there's almost an appeal to listen to the outlier, like implication. Listen to the outlier. Listen to all the body. I think because of the professionalization of ministers, where I could go on and on about that dynamic, but the idea that yes, on one hand, most Protestants, most Christians, certainly Church of Christ, reject the what's that vox humana, that somebody speaks for God, like the Pope or whoever. But largely that's how churches functions. There's one or two people that they hold the keys to the kingdom and everybody else kind of defers to their interpretation, which isn't inherently evil. It does give rise to, lots of abuse maybe, or at least potential for it. But it's that idea that as I walk with Scripture, I want to be open to everybody God's brought me, in my orbit, and trust that he's bringing me the people and understand there's always the third way. That's what's speaking to me about that. So whether that's locked tight, exactly what Jesus was saying, certainly I think that's true in other contexts.
No, yeah, that I definitely see that, and I think it's certainly a part of it. So kind of moving on to what perplexes me. So this is maybe a small perplexion. Jesus makes this comparison. He says, "For John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and you say he has a demon. And the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say, here's a glutton and a drunkard and a friend of tax collectors and sinners." Well, here's the funny part that I just need to work through here. So like, obviously I would not say Jesus is a glutton and a drunkard, but I would absolutely say that Jesus is a friend to tax collectors and sinners. And so I'm just kind of now starting to maybe try to peel back. Could there even be a deeper level here of what I'm trying to, because there's this clear thing. Obviously, John the Baptist did not have a demon, and obviously Jesus was not a drunkard or a glutton. And so now I'm trying to say, is there significance to the fact that Jesus then puts in this thing that is true about him, but that people would see as negative? Like, is there significance that he slips it in there, or is there, or isn't there? I don't know. That's kind of where I'm perplexed.
So in addition to, I'm just trying to, I want to say what I think you just said, and then you fix it, okay? So what we're saying is, this is what, because he says they're calling to each other, so this is what they're saying to each other, and it's coming out of the dynamics of almost reading their thoughts, because it says in the previous verses, they all agree it's John's teaching, or God's teaching, because they'd been baptized with John, the Pharisees didn't. So there's all this disagreement in there and contention, and he's saying that, but is there some truth, specifically in verses 33 and 34, is there some truth to it? Because clearly he is a friend of tax collectors, sinners, this kind of thing. And it's the too much. Well, clearly, I mean, there's no sense that Jesus is an ascetic where he denies himself food and drink that John does. What's interesting is, now I'm going to be taxed on this. I don't know if you have it in easy memory. Ready recollection is the term I grew up with, sorry. But that idea of, did John, was a hallmark of him asceticism? Like, is that what he calls his disciples to, or is that just where he ended up because he was living in the wilderness? Do you remember that?
That's a good question. No, I would have to go and look. And that sounds like a question that's not like, that sounds like a scholarly question that you would have. Like, I'm not recalling any like direct passages where,
like, he's not teaching people to do that.
I don't know. Now that you say that, I'm like, is there a part where he did?
Yeah, because when everybody's coming to him and he's like, hey, it's very pointed, like, okay, soldiers, you do this, and you do this, and you do that, and then, of course, Pharisees, you're brood of vipers and all this,
Sure.
talk. But my point there is, it's an exaggeration. You take some things he did, man, this is us. This is humanity right here. I take some things they did, and if I like it, then all of a sudden it becomes honorable and beautiful. But if I have any criticism of it, it becomes its worst self.
So this is good. Okay, this is helping unlock it for me. In both the things that Jesus is saying that people are saying about him and John the Baptist, there are parts of the truth to their premise, and yet they are still corrupting. And so I think this is further emphasizing the idea that Jesus wants to throw out the premises and the way that these people are viewing the situation and viewing him and viewing John the Baptist and viewing God. Maybe it's a further way of subverting what the common idea in this place was for who John the Baptist was, who Jesus was, and what they were about. So I do wonder, that might be why Jesus slips that in there, is because he wants us to further think and go, well, hey, one, Jesus makes a direct commentary on the attitude and the duality and the hypocrisy of the overall judgment. And then he said, by putting in some of these truths, he's also saying, not only were you hypocritical, but you had half truths to be hypocritical about.
Yeah. Oh, that's really good. It's interesting. I can't even remember who I heard say it, but they were talking, they used the fraction 2/3, that the devil is always 2/3 true. And I think where that was originating from is the Genesis, where he comes to Eve in chapter 3, and he's like, God did X, Y, and Z, and X and Y are true. God knows this. God gives you this. The Z is the false part, that somehow you'll gain, from this. And Eve, of course, is and then Adam, they're deceived there, and that's kind of his function, and of course we're not looking for a literal mathematical equation here, but just that sense that if the devil, I remember Eli Hooper was talking about this last week, if the devil can masquerade as an angel of light, and an angel of light is good, it's the masquerade that's bad, but in terms of your perception, you're good. So expect the devil to share a portion of truth with you. So in other words, every hypocrisy I have, every judgment I have that is false, there's a part of it that's true. And I've leaned, and I've got to be really careful to discern, step back and say, God, what is really happening here? And that's the problem. I don't like asking that question because I like certainty. I've already decided Connor's a good person. If you're running some kind of illicit thing out of your house that I'll eventually be implicated in, I've not noticed it yet. You know what I mean? And I will fight not to believe it despite the facts.
What you don't realize, we're recording right now in my daughter's bedroom. Right under her crib are the illicit drugs that are...
Man, you do a great job hiding that. But, that's the point is, and we do this to God sometimes when we're like, okay, this happened, so this must be the reason why. And that's, our brains are created to kind of create certainty. Like subconsciously, we want to create certainty. It's hard to live in ambiguity, perpetually. But there's a lot of big words right there. But it's hard to live with that uncertainty just forever and ever. So we want to lock it in, and that's okay. But we have to keep, as a safeguard to our souls, keep saying, okay, what is the full truth here? This doesn't deny I have all falsehood. And I think when we have some truth, then we tend to fight for that truth, not noticing I'm also including falsehood in this.
So maybe I could say it like this, and we could be done. Some truth we tend to grasp with a strangulation grip, almost like, this is it, and I can't entertain any other possibility. And so I can't add, I can't subtract to this idea because I have the idea, I have it here. And so much of the time what God wants to do with us is he wants us to hold it with an open palm, and he wants us to allow him to add, to subtract, or to even change completely out what we had in our hand to begin with.
That's good.
Cool.
That's good.
Awesome. Glad we solved it. Yes. Thank you for listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast. We so appreciate it. For everyone who sticks with us through sticks us through an entire episode, kudos to you. And also people who just keep listening when we put them up and enjoy it and find life from that. We just really appreciate that and glad that we can be that. Thanks for listening again. Grace, peace, and love.